Ralph Snyder was a fighter. He wouldn't commit suicide.
Frank, you handled the whole investigation. You talked to every one of those kids.
He didn't smile. He didn't crack jokes, and he definitely didn't play by Hollywood rules. M Squad wasn't your typical cop show. It was raw, it was jazz-soaked, and it starred a man who looked like he'd rather punch you than solve your case. But behind the gritty Chicago streets and Count Basie's pulsing score, nothing went according to plan. The star nearly walked before episode 1. The theme song was recorded in a single chaotic night, and one stunt, it sent someone to the hospital and almost killed the show before it found its rhythm. These are 20 weird facts about M Squad. And buried in the madness, a detective who became a legend by refusing to be a hero. Badge up. This precinct doesn't run clean. Number 1. Lee Marvin didn't want the job. When producers approached him about playing Detective Lieutenant Frank Ballinger, Marvin was fresh off supporting roles in features, building a reputation as Hollywood's go-to heavy. Tough guys, villains, men who didn't need many lines to leave a mark. Television? That felt like a step backward, a trap that would lock him into weekly episodes when he wanted the freedom of film. The money was good, sure, but Marvin had bigger ambitions. He turned them down flat. Then his agent made one call that changed everything. He reminded Marvin that his movie offers had dried up temporarily. And this wasn't just any cop show. It was being produced by Latimer Productions with unusual creative freedom, shot on location in Chicago, not on a backlot. They promised something different. No gimmicks, no sidekicks, just one hard man working Chicago's meanest streets. Marvin read the pilot script in his hotel room, circled 3 scenes where Ballinger threw punches instead of witty comebacks, and called back the next morning. He had one condition: I'm not smiling unless the script earns it. They agreed. And just like that, television had found its most dangerous detective. Marvin would later admit he took the role out of necessity, but he stayed because it let him play a character who felt real, not manufactured. Frank Ballinger didn't win. He survived. And that made all the difference. Number 2. Before the cameras rolled, the show had a completely different title. Producers originally called it Chicago Beat, a straightforward name that emphasized location over character. Network executives liked it. It sounded procedural, reliable, easy to market. But Lee Marvin hated it. He thought it sounded soft, generic, like every other cop show cluttering the airwaves. During a production meeting, Marvin stood up and said, "This isn't about the city, it's about the squad. Call it M Squad." The M stood for murder. The division Ballinger worked. Short, sharp, menacing. Exactly the tone they needed. The producers hesitated. They worried the name sounded too clinical, too cold. Would audiences connect with a show that felt like a police report? But Marvin pushed harder. He argued that the show's entire identity was built on stripping away Hollywood polish. No romantic subplots, no comic relief partners, just one detective doing ugly work in a dirty city. The name had to reflect that. Finally, the network caved. They changed it to M Squad just weeks before the premiere, rushing to update promotional materials, scripts, and opening credits. Some affiliate stations still advertised it under the old name by mistake, confusing viewers who showed up expecting something entirely different. But Marvin was right. M Squad wasn't a show about Chicago. It was a show about the job. And the title made that brutally clear from the first frame. The name became iconic, a 1-2 punch that told you everything you needed to know before the jazz even kicked in. Number 3, Count Basie didn't write the theme song in a studio. He wrote it in a bar. In 1957, Basie was already a jazz legend, but television work, that was new territory. When producers approached him about scoring M Squad, Basie was skeptical. TV themes were short, punchy, disposable. He didn't want his name attached to something forgettable. But they offered him complete creative control and told him the show's tone: dark, urban, relentless. Basie liked that. So one night, he sat down at a piano in a Chicago jazz club with his band, ordered a round of drinks, and started playing. No sheet music, no plan. Just instinct and improvisation. The room was packed, loud, smoky. People were talking, laughing, clinking glasses. But when Basie started hitting those opening notes, the place went quiet. He played it twice, adjusting the tempo, adding horns, sharpening the edges. His band followed him beat for beat, feeding off the energy. By the third pass, they had it. That driving, propulsive theme that would become one of the most recognizable sounds on television. They recorded it the next day in one take. No overdubs, no second chances. What you hear in the opening credits is that same raw performance, captured live with all its imperfections intact. Basie later said he designed it to feel like a heartbeat racing through the city streets, something urgent and unrelenting. The producers loved it immediately, and when M Squad premiered, that theme song hit harder than anything else on TV. It wasn't background noise, it was a warning. Number 4. The show's realism came with a price. M Squad filmed on location in Chicago, using real streets, real alleys, real neighborhoods. No backlot sets, no studio recreations. Producers wanted authenticity, and they got it, but that meant dealing with real weather, real crowds, and real danger. During the first season, a chase scene was filmed in a South Side industrial area at night. Crew members set up lights. Cameras rolled, and Lee Marvin sprinted through a narrow alley. The script called for him to leap over a chain-link fence. Simple enough. Except nobody checked what was on the other side. Marvin vaulted the fence, landed hard, and immediately collapsed. He'd torn through his ankle on a piece of rusted metal jutting from the ground, hidden in the shadows. Blood poured into his boot. He tried to stand, couldn't. Medics rushed in, wrapped it, and wanted to take him to the hospital. Marvin refused. He knew if they shut down production, the whole schedule would implode. So they numbed him up, bandaged him tight, and kept shooting. You can see him limping in the next few episodes if you watch closely. The injury never fully healed. For the rest of the series, Marvin walked with a slight hitch. He never mentioned it on camera, never asked for special treatment. He just worked through it. That was the cost of realism. Not just the look, but the pain that came with it. And Marvin wore that limp like a badge. Number 5. Lee Marvin despised the scripts, not all of them, but enough that it became a problem. He'd sit in his trailer between takes, reading the next episode's pages, and you could hear him cursing from 50 feet away. The issue wasn't the plots. Crime stories were crime stories. What drove him mad was the dialogue. Too neat, too polished, too much like every other cop show. Marvin wanted Frank Ballinger to sound like a real Chicago detective, not a writer's idea of one. So he started rewriting his own lines. Without permission, he'd cross out entire speeches, scribble in something shorter, harder, more brutal. Directors would call action, and Marvin would deliver something completely different from the script. Writers complained, producers held emergency meetings. But when they watched the dailies, they had to admit something. Marvin's version was better. His instinct for the character was sharper than anything they'd written. So, they made a deal. Marvin could change his dialogue, but he had to tell the director beforehand so they could adjust blocking and camera angles. He agreed, and from that point on, Frank Ballinger's voice became Lee Marvin's voice, terse, direct, with a threat simmering under every sentence. Years later, one of the show's writers admitted that Marvin taught them how to write for television, not through notes or story meetings, but by showing them what worked in the moment, in front of the camera, when the pretense fell away. Marvin didn't just play a detective, he became the blueprint for every hard-boiled cop that followed. Number 6. The jazz wasn't just in the theme song, it was everywhere. Count Basie didn't stop at the opening credits. He scored the entire first season, composing cues for chases, shootouts, tense interrogations, quiet moments. And he did it all live in the studio with his full orchestra. No pre-recorded loops, no synthesizers. Just musicians playing in real time while watching rough cuts of the episodes projected on a screen. It was expensive, time-consuming, and completely insane by television standards. But the producers insisted. They wanted M Squad to sound different from everything else on the air, and Basie gave them that. The problem? Basie's schedule was packed. He was touring, recording albums, playing clubs across the country. He couldn't always be in the studio when the way needed him, so sometimes episodes aired with no score at all. Just ambient sound, footsteps, wind, dialogue. And weirdly, it worked. Those silent stretches made the show feel even more raw, more documentary-like. Audiences didn't complain. Critics praised the restraint. But behind the scenes, it was chaos. Music supervisors scrambled to fill gaps. Editors stretched existing cues until they wore thin. By season 2, Basie's involvement dropped off. Other composers stepped in, trying to match his style, but it was never quite the same. The first season remains the definitive sound of M Squad. Every note sharp, every beat intentional. Because when you had Count Basie in the room, you didn't need anything else. Number 7. There was no romantic lead, and that was unheard of. In 1957, every cop show, every detective series, every drama had a love interest. A secretary, a reporter, a neighbor who'd show up in Act 2 with a concerned look and soft lighting. It was formula. Network executives insisted on it. Audiences expected it. But M Squad broke the rule. Frank Ballinger had no girlfriend, no will they won't they subplot, no flirtatious banter. He was married to the job, and the show never apologized for it. When the network pushed back, demanding producers introduce a female character to soften the lead, Lee Marvin exploded. He told them if they added a love interest, he'd walk. He argued that Ballinger's isolation was the point. This wasn't a hero who went home to someone at the end of the day. He went home alone, drank alone, and woke up to do it all again. Romance would ruin that. The producers backed Marvin. The network grumbled but eventually relented. And M Squad became one of the first television dramas to center entirely on a solitary male lead with no romantic arc whatsoever. Female characters appeared, sure, as witnesses, suspects, victims, but they were never there to fix Ballinger or complete him. He was already complete, just damaged. That choice made M Squad feel colder, harsher, more unforgiving than anything else on TV. And it worked, because sometimes the most honest stories are the ones where nobody gets saved by love. They just survive. Number 8. The violence almost killed the show. M Squad didn't just imply brutality, it showed it. Faces slammed into walls, suspects beaten in alleys, blood on knuckles, broken furniture, real pain. For 1957, it was shocking. Standards and Practices, the network's censorship board, flagged nearly every episode. They sent memos demanding cuts, threatening to pull the show off the air if producers didn't tone it down. Lee Marvin refused to back down. He argued that watering down the violence would make the show dishonest. Real detectives didn't politely ask criminals to cooperate. They used force, and if M Squad was going to claim authenticity, it had to show that reality. The standoff lasted weeks. Network lawyers got involved. Advertisers grew nervous. Some stations threatened to drop the show from their lineup. Finally, a compromise was reached. M Squad could keep the violence, but it had to serve the story. No gratuitous shots, no lingering on injuries, no glorification. Every punch had to have a purpose. Marvin agreed, knowing he'd already won, and the show continued pushing boundaries, episode after episode, testing how far they could go. Some scenes still got cut. A few episodes were edited so heavily they barely made sense. But enough of the rawness remained to make M Squad the most brutal cop show of its era, and audiences loved it. Not because they wanted blood, but because they wanted truth. And sometimes, truth is violent. Number 9. Paul Newland played Captain Gray, Ballinger's commanding officer, and he hated every second. Not the role, the schedule. M Squad filmed fast, sometimes cranking out entire episodes in 3 or 4 days. That meant long hours, night shoots, constant pressure. Newland, a veteran character actor used to more relaxed film productions, couldn't keep up. He'd show up to set exhausted, lines half memorized, temper short. During one particularly brutal week, Newland and Lee Marvin got into a screaming match between takes. The argument wasn't about the script or the performance. It was about respect. Newland felt Marvin was bulldozing everyone on set, rewriting scenes, demanding retakes, controlling every aspect of production. Marvin fired back that Newland wasn't pulling his weight, that he was sleepwalking through scenes. The crew froze. For a moment, it looked like punches might fly. Then the director stepped in, called a break, and separated them. They finished the episode in cold silence, but something shifted after that. Newland started bringing more energy, more focus, and Marvin, in his own way, backed off a little. They never became friends, but they developed a mutual understanding. Both men were professionals, and the work mattered more than their egos. By the end of the series, Newland admitted that working with Marvin taught him how to be tougher, faster, more committed. And Marvin, he never apologized. He didn't need to. The work spoke for itself. Number 10. The show's creator, Frank Grubber, based Frank Ballinger on a real Chicago detective he'd interviewed years earlier. This cop, whose name was never publicly revealed, worked homicide in the late 1940s and had a reputation for being brutal, effective, and deeply cynical. Grubber met him during research for a crime novel that never got published. They spent an evening in a bar, and the detective told stories that made Grubber's stomach turn. Not because they were graphic, but because they were empty. This man had seen so much death, so much cruelty, that he'd stopped feeling anything. He didn't hate criminals. He didn't pity victims. He just processed cases like paperwork and moved on. When Grubber started developing M Squad, he used that detective as the foundation for Bollinger. The detachment, the efficiency, the refusal to be heroic. Lee Marvin never met the real cop, but Grubber described him in detail during pre-production. Marvin listened, asked a few questions, then nodded. He understood exactly who this man was. Years later, after the show ended, Grubber tried to reconnect with the detective to tell him about M Squad. He couldn't find him. No forwarding address, no records, nothing. Some people who knew the detective said he'd retired and disappeared somewhere out west. Others whispered darker theories, but Grubber never got closure. The man who inspired Frank Bollinger vanished, just like the character would have wanted. And maybe that was the most fitting end, because men like that don't stick around for applause. They just fade into the city they spent their lives protecting. Number 11. The show's cancellation had nothing to do with ratings. M Squad was pulling strong numbers through its second season, consistently beating competitors in its time slot. Advertisers were happy, audiences were loyal, but behind closed doors, NBC was making a calculated business decision. They wanted to own their programming outright, not license it from independent producers. M Squad was produced by Latimer Productions and distributed by MCA, meaning NBC paid for broadcast rights but didn't control the show. The network offered to buy the series completely. Latimer refused. They knew syndication rights would be worth a fortune down the line and weren't about to hand over ownership. NBC gave them an ultimatum: sell or we cancel. Latimer called their bluff. NBC wasn't bluffing. After 117 episodes, M Squad was pulled from the schedule mid-season with no finale, no closure, no explanation to viewers. Lee Marvin found out from a crew member, not the producers. He was furious but not surprised. He'd seen how the business worked. Years later, Latimer made millions reselling M Squad to local stations across the country. NBC got nothing, and Marvin, he walked away richer and more famous than when he'd started, ready for the movie career that would make him a legend. Number 12. Guest stars hated working with Marvin, not because he was cruel, but because he was intimidating. Actors would show up excited to be on M Squad, thinking they'd bond with the star between takes, maybe grab lunch, swap stories. Instead, Marvin barely acknowledged them. He'd sit alone in his trailer, smoking, running lines in silence. When cameras rolled, he was fully present, totally professional. But the moment the director called cut, he'd disappear. One guest actor, a young up-and-comer hoping to make an impression, tried striking up a conversation about acting technique. Marvin stared at him for 5 long seconds, then said, "Don't act, just do it." That was the entire exchange. The actor later admitted he spent the rest of the shoot terrified. But watching Marvin work changed how he approached his own career. No fuss, no ego, just complete commitment to the moment. Other guest stars had similar experiences. Marvin wasn't rude, he was focused. He treated the set like a job site, not a social club. And that energy, that intensity, it elevated everyone around him, whether they liked it or not. Number 13. During a fight scene in season 1, a stunt went horribly wrong. The script called for Bollinger to throw a suspect through a glass window. Standard television stuff. They'd done it a dozen times before, but this time, the prop department made a mistake. Instead of using breakaway glass, they installed regular tempered glass and forgot to swap it out. Nobody noticed. The director called action. Marvin grabbed the stunt performer and hurled him toward the window. The man hit solid glass at full force. It didn't break. He bounced back, crashed to the floor, unconscious. The set went silent. Medics rushed in. The stunt performer woke up minutes later with a concussion and cracked ribs. Production shut down immediately. Lee Marvin sat on the curb outside, head in his hands, devastated. He thought he'd killed someone. The stunt performer recovered fully and, incredibly, didn't sue. He knew it was an accident, but new safety protocols were implemented immediately. Every prop was checked 3 times. Every stunt was rehearsed with Marvin present. The incident shook everyone. For weeks afterward, Marvin was quieter than usual, more careful with physical scenes, haunted by what almost happened. Number 14. M Squad's writer's room was legendary for its dysfunction. Arguments erupted daily. Scripts were thrown across the room. One writer quit after being told his dialogue sounded like a greeting card. The problem wasn't talent. Everyone in that room was skilled. The problem was vision. Some writers wanted M Squad to be more traditional, with mysteries that wrapped up neatly. Others wanted it darker, more ambiguous. Frank Gruber, the creator, sided with darkness. He pushed for episodes where Bollinger didn't always win, where criminals walked free on technicalities, where justice was messy and incomplete. Network executives hated this. They wanted heroes, not anti-heroes. The writers caught in the middle burned out fast. Turnover was constant. By season 2, only 2 original writers remained. The rest were replacements trying to match a tone they didn't fully understand. You can see it in the episodes. Some are tight, but brutal, they're perfect. Others feel soft, compromised, like they're apologizing for existing. But the best episodes, the ones where Bollinger walks away with nothing resolved, those are the ones people remember. Because they didn't feel like television. They felt like life. Number 15. Lee Marvin chain-smoked through every episode. On-screen, off-screen, between takes. His fingers were constantly stained yellow. The smell of tobacco clung to every costume. Directors learned to work around it, incorporating cigarettes into scenes even when the script didn't call for them. Marvin would light up mid-dialogue, exhale smoke while staring down a suspect, flick ash into evidence bags. It became part of Bollinger's character, that restless, self-destructive energy. But behind the scenes, it was a problem. Crew members complained about the smoke. Guest actors with allergies struggled to breathe. The network sent memos asking Marvin to cut back. He ignored them. Smoking wasn't just a habit for Marvin. It was armor, a way to create distance, to stay in character, to keep people at arm's length. By the show's end, he was going through 3 packs a day. His voice had dropped half an octave, raspier, harder. That gravelly tone would define his film career. But it came at a cost. Years later, Marvin would admit the cigarettes nearly killed him. But on M Squad, they made him immortal.
Yeah, I'll bet you are. Why did you ring Halper in?
Number 16. The Chicago Police Department loved M Squad. They provided technical advisors, opened precinct houses for filming, even lent actual detectives to coach actors. But there was tension. Some officers felt the show made them look too brutal, too willing to bend rules. Others complained that Bollinger worked alone too much. Real detectives had partners. They followed procedure, they filed paperwork. Bollinger did none of that. During one precinct visit, a detective confronted Lee Marvin directly. He said the show was making cops look like thugs. Marvin didn't back down. He told the detective that if police work was clean and easy, there wouldn't be any crime. The detective walked away furious, but later that night, he approached Marvin again, quieter this time. He admitted that Bollinger got one thing right: the loneliness. That's what nobody understood. How isolating the job was, how it changed you, how it made normal life impossible. Marvin listened, nodded, and said, "That's the show." They shook hands. And from that point on, the department's cooperation deepened. Because M Squad wasn't celebrating police work, it was showing the cost.
Jim Landry's embezzlement had started about 2 months prior.
Number 7, Tuck-In. The show almost got a theatrical movie. After season 1's success, producers floated the idea of an M Squad feature film. Bigger budget, extended runtime, theatrical release. Lee Marvin was interested, but only if they could make it even darker than the show. No network censors, no standards and practices, just pure noir. They commissioned a script. The story involved Bollinger hunting a cop killer across Chicago's underworld, with an ending where he exacts revenge outside the law. It was brutal, uncompromising, exactly what Marvin wanted. But the studio got cold feet. They worried a theatrical release would cannibalize the TV show's audience. They also feared the script was too violent for 1958 moviegoers. Test readers called it nihilistic and deeply depressing. The project was shelved. The script was never filmed, but rumors persisted for years that Marvin kept a copy and wanted to revisit it after M Squad ended. He never did. By the time his film career took off, he'd moved past Bollinger. But that unmade movie haunts M Squad's legacy. A glimpse of what the show could have been without any restrictions at all. Number 18. Frank Ballinger never smiled. Not once in 117 episodes. It wasn't written into the script. It was Lee Marvin's choice. He believed the character had nothing to smile about. Every case reminded him of humanity's worst impulses. Every day was a grind. Happiness wasn't part of the equation. Directors occasionally asked him to soften his expression, just slightly, in moments of victory or relief. Marvin refused every time. He'd say, "Ballinger doesn't celebrate catching criminals. He just starts looking for the next one." That commitment created an iconic image. A man so hardened by his work that joy became impossible. Critics called it one of television's most disciplined performances. Marvin called it survival. He knew that if Ballinger smiled even once, the entire character would crumble. The audience would stop believing. So he kept that stone face for 3 years, never breaking, never softening. And it made Frank Ballinger unforgettable. Because in a medium built on charm and likability, Marvin gave viewers someone who didn't care if you liked him or not. He had work to do. Number 19. The final episode wasn't meant to be the final episode. When NBC canceled M Squad, 7 scripts were already written for the rest of the season. They'd been paid for, outlined, ready to shoot, but the network pulled the plug so abruptly that none of them were produced. The last episode that aired, The Badge, featured Ballinger investigating a cop accused of corruption. It ended on an ambiguous note, the suspect's guilt unresolved. Ballinger walking into the night with more questions than answers. By accident, it became the perfect series finale, because Frank Ballinger's story didn't have an ending. He wasn't the kind of character who rode off into the sunset or retired peacefully. He just kept working until someone pulled the plug. Lee Marvin never got to say goodbye to the role properly. No final speech, no rap party, no curtain call. One day he was Detective Ballinger. The next day, he wasn't. Years later, Marvin said that felt right, because Ballinger wouldn't have wanted a farewell. He would have just clocked out and disappeared. Number 20. M Squad changed television forever, but nobody noticed at the time. Critics praised it, audiences watched it, but the industry didn't see it as revolutionary, just another cop show. But look closer. M Squad pioneered the anti-hero protagonist years before The Sopranos made it fashionable. It used jazz scoring the way modern shows use electronic music. It shot on location when everyone else used sound stages. It ended episodes without resolution, without comfort, without hope. Every modern crime drama owes something to M Squad. The Wire, True Detective, Bosch, they all walked the path Frank Ballinger walked first. Lee Marvin never got credit for inventing the archetype. He was too busy becoming a movie star. But the legacy lives on, buried in those 117 episodes, waiting for anyone brave enough to watch a show that refuses to make you feel better about the world. M Squad didn't change television because it was loud. It changed television because it was honest. And sometimes, honesty is the most revolutionary act of all. Bonus fact. After M Squad ended, Lee Marvin kept one piece of the show. Not a script, not a prop, but Frank Ballinger's hat. A simple gray fedora, worn in nearly every episode, sweat-stained and bent from 3 years of Chicago location shoots. Marvin took it home and wore it for years, not to events or premieres, but on quiet days when he didn't want to be recognized. He'd pull it low over his eyes and disappear into crowds, just another face in the city. Friends said it grounded him, reminded him where he'd come from before the Oscars and the stardom. And on rare occasions, late at night in Hollywood bars, someone would ask if he missed playing Ballinger. Marvin would adjust that hat, take a slow sip of his drink, and say just 2 words. Every day. Because Frank Ballinger wasn't just a role. He was the part of Lee Marvin that never smiled, never softened, never stopped working. And that part of him, it never really left.